This interview was recorded at the Psychedelic Science 2025 in Denver, where we spoke with leading voices in psychedelic research, therapy, spirituality and policy. In this special interview, we bring you a rare and moving interfaith conversation between two spiritual leaders who are helping to reshape the relationship between religion and psychedelics. Hunter Priest is an Episcopal priest and the founder of Legatum, a Christian psychedelic society. Sughra Ahmed is a British Muslim scholar and community leader and one of the first Muslims to participate in a psilocybin study designed for religious professionals. We sat down with both of them at Psychedelic Science 2025 in Denver, where they reflected on their personal journeys, the challenges and promises of psychedelic use within religious traditions, and how these experiences can open doors for deeper understanding, not just within their faiths, but between them. Let's listen in. Can you talk a little bit about your religious upbringing, education, if there were any place for mystical experiences in those education, what you got as a child?
I was brought up in a family of, we were practicing Christians and fairly involved in our church community. I don't remember a lot of talk about mystical experiences and that, but I just always was open to it. And I'm not sure why exactly. I just was. I think it was in nature often that I would have those experiences where I would have some sense of the presence of God outside, or when I was in the mountains or just playing outside. I would just always, looking up at the clouds, just always saw that as a sign that we weren't alone in the world, even as a little kid, as a child. And then, and I would have those experiences in church too. And they were almost spontaneous because I don't think I remember anyone teaching me about what a mystical experience was. I just, at communion or just sometimes just being in church, I would have this just sense that God was surrounding me and holding me up. And I wouldn't have labeled it mystical experience because I didn't have that language, but now I look back on it and say that's exactly what it was. So I think maybe I was just more open to it. I'm not sure, but. Yeah.
Sughra, what about you?
So I grew up in a Muslim household in the north of England, and my family heritage comes from Pakistan. So my maternal grandfather had made that move to the UK. So I guess being a newer generation, there were lots of different kinds of competing priorities for my family when I was growing up. My parents being able to work and to be able to sort of give us a decent life, and education was part of that, including religious education. So whilst they are not extensively educated in terms of religion, they thought it was important to send us to the masjid, the mosque, to madrasa after school, Monday to Friday, for 2 hours. And I got a lot of my religious education from there, but I wouldn't say spiritual. It was very sort of much rote learning. So I didn't really feel any kind of mysticism or spirituality in that experience. Where I did feel it though was at home. And when I look back now, as I think about it, that really comes from, the way in which the Qawwali, for example, the music, the art form, act of worship for many Qawwali singers, the way Qawwali would be performed. And so my dad would have these old video cassettes of Qawwali groups from Pakistan, and there would be recordings. And so when they would miss home, as it were, or their culture, they would play those. And I don't think my parents ever realized that I was even watching. But the way in which the singers get swept away with their words and with the rhythm and with the music, that for me said spirituality. And aside from that, there are strong traditions around dhikr, which is the remembrance of God. There's whirling. There are all sorts of mind-altering experiences within the Islamic tradition, Muslim traditions. But I didn't experience them when I was growing up. I came to learn about them as I grew older.
So both of you participated in the same psychedelic study conducted by Johns Hopkins University, Bill Richards and Roland Griffiths. Can you tell me how and why did you make this decision to enter this study?
Well, for me, I believe I was when I signed up for the study had actually closed. So I was very late to the conversation, as it were. A friend of mine saw an advert and shared it with me and said, you must sign up. And so I had very strong sense of, nervousness about whether this would be okay for me, as not just as Sughra, but also as a person who believes in a particular faith, and is this okay? And so I discussed at length with some friends, and we came to understand that actually when it comes to psychedelics, particularly in this case mushrooms, that we are not talking about something that veils the mind in the way that the Quran has talked about, for example, with alcohol, that we're talking about something that unveils the mind and it lifts the veils between you and yourself. It sounds really strange, but when you take medicine like this with the right intention, with the right support, you can actually have a really profound, very serious, life-changing encounter with your core self, your true self. And all of the things that don't really matter, but in the day occupy our mind, occupy our attention, our brain, these things just disappear. And you go right to the core of what matters to you most. So for me, it was a really difficult choice at the beginning, but it was the right choice in the end.
So in my case, somewhat involved in advertisement, but I saw an advertisement in a magazine. I was at home on an afternoon, just flipping through a magazine, saw the ad for it, and I thought, of course I'm interested in this. But it was more, I wasn't so much interested in the mystical experience. I was interested in the fact that these researchers wanted to hear from religious professionals around the mental health questions. And I knew about the research at Hopkins, but I didn't know a lot about it. And the fact that there was a connection to my work as a clergy person just excited me. I just thought, I couldn't believe they cared, honestly, of what religious professionals thought. So I went not so much with a sense of wanting to have a mystical experience or even understanding that was what was a part of it. I wanted to be part of this medical research around mental health and depression and anxiety and addiction. And I also just thought it would be an adventure. So my motivation was both about the research and just, I thought, wow, Johns Hopkins and psilocybin, I had not done it before, and it just seemed like the perfect opportunity to do that and wondered what I was going to bring to the conversation after my experience. I was just curious about that. So it was really more out of a sense of curiosity.
How much this was an individualized experience or a collective experience? Because you're like a group of religious leaders, so could you like converse about your experiences there? Did you have any opportunity to do that or not?
It was an individual experience with each of us separately with two guides, and because of privacy laws in the States, they couldn't tell us who else was involved in it. So it took several years for us to begin to find each other. And I think part of it was when I started the organization then I was public, and people started finding me that way. And then we got ourselves all connected, and became a cohort of religious leaders who'd had this shared experience, and ended up asking for a retreat that we could, not a psychedelic retreat, but a chance for all of us to meet together and hear each other's stories. And we kept asking and asking and asking, which was unusual for study groups. And we finally were able to do that 2 years ago, and it was in 2023, and it was a very important moment for all of us, right? So.
Incredibly important. I think also we were unusual in individually asking for an opportunity to meet each other. As far as I know, the scientists shared that they've never had any group. They've done lots and lots of different kinds of studies, but at no point has a group articulated this need. And in our group, it was widespread. There were many of us that were asking for this gathering.
Some people criticized the study because the language and the symbolism and the music was more like Christian leaning. Would you agree with that, Sughra, or how did you see it?
I feel if a study is aiming to recruit a diverse range of people, in this case, religious professionals, religious leaders, and so, they would have warmly welcomed. They clearly had lots of different kinds of Christianity, a little bit of sort of diversity in terms of the Jewish cohort. I was the only Muslim, there was only one Buddhist, but if there had been Hindu and Sikh and Jain and Zoroastrian, all of these different traditions, that would have been amazing, and maybe a future study could look at that. But if that was the intention of this study, then I think that the way in which the setting, the playlist, for example, the way in which they would have been designed would have been more open, expansive, more inclusive. I feel that what I received was something that would be extremely well suited to somebody who is of a Christian disposition, but also quite acclimated and enjoys sort of high church music. It wasn't just any Christian music. It was sort of Bach and maybe even Mozart and sort of very, high-end classical music. Whilst I enjoy that kind of music, I grew up in England. I went to an Anglo-Catholic primary school. We would go to mass every Tuesday morning. There would be lots and lots of church music. But for a time where I'm becoming my most vulnerable, my most open self, and I'm giving myself to the safety of this experience, to the set and setting, not just to the guides, which I know will dramatically influence what I then go on to experience. I would have really appreciated more diversity in, for example, the playlist. But by the time I got to the study, so many people had already gone through it that they couldn't change it for me, unfortunately.
Yeah. I know it's very difficult to speak about mystical experiences or psychedelic experiences, but how would you describe what you experienced?
I think for me, both my experiences were extremely profound, and each had its own theme. So my first experience, the theme was love, and that we as sentient beings, so humans, but also other types of existence, we need to learn to communicate more with our hearts rather than with our heads. That we've made a mistake in understanding that our primary brain is this brain, but actually needs to be this, and maybe even gut. The way in which we communicate does not necessarily have to come from the brain. It can come from the heart and from the gut, and it is equally of value, if not more, actually. And I experienced that in many different ways. I felt like I felt like it was the most profound thing at the time, and now I'm trying to explain it, and it feels so sort of regular. What's the big deal? And I think that's where the word ineffable comes into these experiences. It's very, very hard to be able to articulate what you experience. And even today, as I'm talking about it in my heart and in my mind, I can play it back, and it moves me. So it was very, very profound. My second experience, the theme for which was the womb, that the womb is the center of all creation, and that God is also therefore womb. Being somebody who believes that God created everything that exists, that God therefore is womb, and then womb on earth, whether it's in humans or animals or plant in different forms, that we should have such an incredible sense of reverence for the womb that in my experience, I saw two women who mean a lot to me who have had children, and I just fell at their feet in complete and utter awe and gratitude for what they have done for the human race. Millions, billions of people have been doing this. Billions of females of whatever kind have been doing this since we began. And in my experience, I felt that we have taken that for granted to such an extreme degree that we don't even have national conversations, even community conversations about how incredibly fortunate we are that females continue to do this again and again so the rest of us can survive. And that when a woman, becomes pregnant, she holds, she gives birth, she then raises that child. There may be other people involved in all of this, but she's at the center of it. Actually, she's in most cultures, in most contexts, she's the one that is sort of given the least attention for what she has done, let alone gratitude. And that really hurt. That was very, very painful. So yeah, I think that's the best that I can do in terms of describing both my experiences.
That's pretty good. Thank you.
Yeah.
Hunt?
So I had we've had two experiences a month apart, and both of mine were very physical. My body was very engaged in both of them. And Sughra alluded to this too. For one thing, it allowed me to see that so much of the decision making and leadership that I was doing was coming out of my brain, which we need to engage, but I had lost my sense of heart. I lost my sense of the wisdom of my body, or my gut, kind of my gut instincts. And so the first session was, I think it was a fairly classical Kundalini awakening. It was to say it was energetic is an understatement. It was explosive in its energy and this current moving through my body. And it was only upon reflection that afternoon and then later was I able to frame it in a Christian way. I just didn't even have the language to talk about it. And then I started thinking about, there's a line in scripture where Paul says that the body is a temple of the Holy Spirit. And that energy that was moving through me, I began to see that as I began to think of the Holy Spirit and God even as an energetic force and field that's always present and always moving. And it was only because of the psilocybin that part of my brain that would try to explain it was shut down, and then I just had the full experience without having to analyze it. So that was the first experience, and it was so important for me to get out of my head and into my body. And that was probably the biggest takeaway from that experience. A month later, I'm back there at Hopkins, and again, a physical experience, but not quite as dramatic. My experience was more of my body being in these positions. Like at one point I was rocking like this. I was uncomfortable, I was rocking, and I thought about how Jewish people pray, and often Orthodox in their rock like this. And so that was, and I'm like, oh golly, this is a form of prayer using my body. And then I found myself flat on my stomach on the sofa with my head on the cushion, and I thought about how Muslims pray off with their head on the ground. So I just had this experience of body prayer that we often don't have in Christianity, that I think Jewish and Muslim people have a much better sense of. I think often Christians pray seated with their head bowed, and that's about the only physicality is just bowing their head. And I think to see that our bodies, to engage our bodies in our full religious and spiritual life, including, I would say, our sexuality, but to say our bodies that's where the Spirit lives. So I began to develop a much more body-centered theology that was less about what I could figure out in my head and more about how I was experiencing God in my body. And that included some eroticism that was in both of those experiences. It wasn't scary or didn't feel, it just felt this is part of how we live as creatures created by a loving and benevolent source. So, but probably the biggest takeaway from the second session was this embodied sense of prayer. So, which I think I could credit my Jewish and Muslim brothers and sisters for in the way that they see it, in a way that Christians don't often see it. So,
according to the followers of perennial tradition, the mystics speak the same language in all religions. Do you think there is any truth in that?
I mean, whether there's truth in it or not, I think what's really, really important that traditions can maintain that the sort of sense of life that comes through their tradition. So however they choose to express their mysticism, that particular pathway is alive and well, and it's passed from one generation to another. I think that vibrancy of having so many different ways in which you can express your mysticism is a really important part of being human, or being a faithful person, being a mystical person, a spiritual person. I think if there was, this kind of, if we had this mindset, well, they're all leading to the same thing. So, let's narrow it down, let's narrow the pool down, and maybe these 2 or 3 are the best right now, or they seem to be showing best results, or they seem to be the most accessible. I think losing all the other ways of entering a sense of your inner being would just be a huge disservice to humanity. For me, the really important thing is to bring these mystical traditions alive in the modern day across modern generations. So for example, in Islam, plenty of Muslim communities, Sufi and others, engage in the act of dhikr or zikr, which is a remembrance of God, repeatedly, rhythmically, and that rhythmic fashion gives you a sense of mind-altering experience. That's quite commonplace. What isn't so commonplace is people who are engaging in some kind of ritualistic dance, whether it's whirling or something else. That's seen as quite niche to some communities, and other communities, within Islam don't really engage in that. So what I would like to see is more sort of cross-fertilization across the sects within a faith tradition, to see whether there can be that act of mystical experience can be beneficial to more people rather than fewer.
Yeah, I think one of the things about mystical experiences and spirituality across traditions, I think it's to drop down into that level of experience and knowing, it's easier to communicate. Even if the doctrine and the practice and the history of these religions, they're interconnected, but very and distinct at the same time. They're culturally formed, so they're not all the same. But I think when you can drop down into an experiential place, there's a openness for understanding and conversation that you can't get at a doctrinal or dogmatic level. So, one of the results of this study that we were both in is that or at least most of the participants not only had a deeper appreciation of their own tradition, but of the others. And I'm wondering if that's not because in our various ways had our own experiences of God, and that just opened us up to other people's experiences of God, whether they're the same or different. So I think mystics across time and history are able to connect at levels that sort of classical theologians can't, because that's about doctrine. So I think there's a communication that can happen at that level that can't happen at this more intellectual level. It's more of a debate. And I think at the experiential and mystical level, it's an appreciation. Does that sound?
That's beautiful.
Yeah, that just came to me sort of as we were talking. But yeah, I think there's...
That's beautiful.
Yeah. It's not to mash them all together, but it's to say, somewhere in the mix of all that, there's an appreciation and respect and knowing that you can't get when you're arguing about theology.
Yeah. Definitely.
What about you as individuals? Did these experiences change the way how you connect to God as everyday practitioners of religion?
For me, I think so. Yeah, I believe so. I think my practice changed. My practice changed in the sense that I became more at ease with conversing with the divine in less formal ways, in informal ways, in the everyday. In Islam, there is pretty much a prayer or a phrase of gratitude for every single thing. If it's raining and the heavens open and it's raining like crazy, there's a prayer for that, a prayer of appreciation, a prayer of gratitude. If there is a drought, there is also a prayer for that. So there's something about bringing those prayers, those words to life in my everyday a lot more than I had before, but also not feeling curtailed because I'm not fluent in classical Arabic, or I may not have memorized all of the phrases, but to actually use the languages that I do know, so Urdu, Punjabi, English, and speak in those languages to the divine, because of course the divine, there's no barrier, right? And many times converse with emotions and feelings and feel like that is an act of worship. So worship became less formal for me and therefore more frequent and more normalized. I think there's a place for formal worship. I miss not engaging in formal worship as much as I used to, and I hope that comes back. But I'm also trusting my spirit to take me to the right place as and when I need to. So when that becomes more of a force in my life, I will definitely engage with that in the way that my soul is calling me to. But I'm also trying to find comfort in the fact that when it comes to informality in prayer, that is okay by God too, right? That's also warmly welcomed, because that's not how I was raised. The way I was raised is that formal prayer is of paramount importance, and actually nobody really talked about having conversations with God. So I'm really enjoying that.
No, that's good. I think, I know my personal practice of meditation and immediately after those sessions, it deepened my own personal practice and quieting down, finding stillness, quieting my mind at least once a day for 20 or 25 minutes, and tried to do twice a day. But for me, who can be kind of frenetic, that was an immediate benefit of that experience I had, which was so embodied. And I'm not sure what the connection is, but it was easier for me to settle down after having this wildly ecstatic experience with psilocybin. I think the other thing that changed professionally or with my vocation is that I appreciated, so in the Christian tradition, often when prayers are said for the sick or somebody struggling, we would lay hands on their head, we would anoint them. And I would do that, I'm a little embarrassed to say this, but I would do that in a perfunctory way because I knew it was important to touch and pray with people. But once I had that experience of almost the electrification of my body, which got more dramatically increased when one of my guides touched me on the shoulder, just because I was struggling, I began to really have a way larger and newer appreciation of what it means to intentionally hold somebody, what I would say now is the crown chakra, to hold them and to take a minute and to trust that there's some energetic transfer that's happening. And I would have never used that language before. But because I'd experienced this dramatic energy in my body and a transfer of energy from my guide, I realized that we can do that for each other. So it really changed how I understood my work, pastoral care, caring for people, praying with people, in a way that was so much deeper and more meaningful and more real, because it had a physical aspect to it that it didn't have before. So that's really important. Really important.
So many people still believe that psychedelics are not compatible with Islam or the Christian tradition. And my understanding that you believe that it can deepen your faith or your path. What kind of response or reaction do you get from your communities when you speak about your experiences, and how does it make you feel?
In the organization that I'm a part of and started, it's a place for Christians to come together to talk about either experience of psychedelics they'd had before. So Ligare, which is the organization I started, it's a place for people to come together to talk about the possibility of working with psychedelics or having had an experience, find other people to talk to. And I think we have maybe 2,800 people on our mailing list. And so the people I'm talking to mostly are wide open and want to have the experience. At an institutional level, so you think about institutional church level, there's not a lot of interest. There's not a lot of judgment about it. There's just not a lot of interest. And I think I'm not sure why that is, but I think in some ways religious institutions now, at least in the United States, are just in a survival mode, trying to just maintain. And we've had 50 years of bad information here about psychedelics. Most Christians are in some ways law-abiding, and they don't want to break the law, even if there's not a problem with substances. So I've not gotten a lot of formal resistance, but I've not gotten a lot of formal interest at an institutional level. And I'm hoping it's changing, but I've not gotten a lot of complete pushback or like what you're talking about is antithetical to Christianity. I'm not.
You know, when I first engaged in the trial, I made a calculated decision not to share the fact that I'm doing this with anybody. And as a result, these things can become quite lonely experiences. I was reminded of that recently in an interview, and I hadn't quite thought of it like that. But I made that judgment based on what I thought I knew about my family, my friends, my community, and so on. And 7-8 years later, when we're sitting here now having this conversation, I have spent the last 2 years talking publicly about my experience. I have spent time organizing a community. I lead something called Ruhani now, which means spirit, the work of the spirit, the soul, which gathers Muslims from different parts of the world who are psychedelically experienced and want to talk about it, want to make meaning from it, want to organize, want to educate. And I reflect on all of these years, and I'm quite surprised at the journey that I've taken. As soon as I became public about my experience, I, from my own community, found that people were either really curious, they wanted to know more, they didn't understand too much, they wanted to know more, all the way to being very, very excited that finally there was some place, there was some container where they could actually have conversations about this openly. Whether they wanted to be public about their involvement, that's up to them. That's not what Rouhani does. We have a confidential sort of, we have an environment where we cultivate confidentiality and anonymity for those who need it or who want it. And so I feel like my journey has really evolved. I made assumptions about my community that so far have not actually transpired, nor about my family actually. I've mentioned this to my family and to be honest with you, they're barely listening because they have little children that are running around all the time and they barely hear me when I say, oh, well, I'm going to Denver for this conference on psychedelics, which I just said to my sister the other day. And she said, okay, well, have a safe trip. and I thought, she doesn't want a conversation about psychedelics. And it's like, well, that's your work. Do it well. We wish you the very, very best. And I think sometimes we can, or at least in my case, I can overthink these things. I thought that, I would be under some kind of pressure for having taken drugs. And even though people don't understand psychedelics fully, in my culture, in my traditions, there's a very strong relationship between healing and plants, and herbs and spices. And so for a lot of people, it's like, oh, plant medicine, I can understand that. I don't need to be an expert, I don't need to know too much about it, but I can understand why you would get there to that place. So that's been really, really pleasant. I'm also excited about having conversations with scholarship across the world in Muslim communities. There is a fatwa that was issued by a Grand Ayatollah Rouhani from Iran, I think probably about 7 or 8 years ago now, that made it permissible to use psychedelics for mental health, for healing, for growth. And I'm curious about whether other scholars might want to follow suit. And I don't think that can happen without good conversation between those who have experience with psychedelics and can speak to the positive benefits that they have experienced and how this is not a fast track way to meet God. I mean, that's really kind of miniaturizing and diminishing the role of plant medicine in healing and in spiritual growth. That meeting or encountering the divine, we all know, sitting here, it takes decades of practice, and that practice is important. We've talked about those practices in our own traditions. This is not something to circumvent those. This is in addition to the traditions that we already have that offer mind-altering experiences. Plant medicines can also offer a pathway to healing, to growth. In my own experience, I was able to move through some of the toxic behaviors and tones that I've picked up in the way that I've been taught religion and Islam. Not just Islam, but also I have a strong exposure to Christianity. And I know my experience to be true, and therefore that supersedes the toxicity that I was taught, and that never really sat right anyway, to be honest, especially not being a woman. So I feel like there's a real appreciation on my part for having experienced it. Now, if I was sat here talking to you not having experienced it, I probably wouldn't have that appreciation. So my hope is that we can share that more and more within our communities of different religious traditions and help more people understand that you don't have to do this if you don't want to. You don't even have to advocate for it. But it's here. It's only going to grow. And the key is that we become experts in understanding how it can benefit our communities, rather than turning our face away from it.
If you look to the future, are you hopeful or optimistic that these substances can one day become a kind of sacraments for your religions?
There isn't sacrament in Islam. However, when I participated in the clinical trial, I asked for a few minutes on my own to perform a prayer that is, part of my tradition. And that wasn't part of the trial, of course. And the scientists were gracious enough to say, okay, fine. So that for me felt like intention setting had already happened. Now I was grounding myself in the company of the divine. And it was my opportunity to engage one-on-one with God and really sort of have a conversation about the fact that I'm doing this with the best of intentions. And I'm doing this with a lot of courage, actually. It's quite frightening. It's quite scary. And I trust nothing and no one to protect me except you. And so I am doing this as part of my spiritual growth, my mental health healing, my overall healing. Be with me. Don't abandon me. Stay with me throughout this. As when the scientists came back in and I was offered the psilocybin, there was something holy about that act. And ingesting it, saying the phrase Bismillah, I begin this in the name of God, which is a common phrase that Muslims use when they engage in any act. So, if you start eating a meal, you say Bismillah. So saying Bismillah and then ingesting it, for me felt like it was an act of worship. So sacrament doesn't exist, but there are these things that felt really important to me.
Yeah, I think in Christianity, the sacraments, the capital S sacraments of the church are set. They've been set for a long time. Whether some traditions have 2, Eucharist, communion, and baptism. Some have 7. My tradition and the Anglican Episcopal Church, the Anglican tradition has 7. Those are set, and I think these substances are sacramental in that they give us access to God, experiences of God, which the sacraments do. So, as I talk about this, I don't think we need to replace the bread and wine of the Eucharist with mushrooms, for example. And I think lots of Christians already do. I think more and more Christians will understand that these experiences, if people decide to work with psychedelics, can open them up to these bigger experiences of God. So that's how I like to think about it. I don't think this is a Sunday morning activity for church people, but I think it's a retreat. I think it's small groups of people gathering, because it's already happening, small groups of people gathering to have these experiences, and they need a container and a lens through which to understand them, make meaning of them. And whether it's Christianity, Judaism, Islam, or any other tradition, there's story and there's ritual and there's community, there's tradition that can help make sense of it. So it's not antithetical to the Christian tradition at all to have experiences of God and then come back to the tradition and say, well, I wonder how this fits in, or maybe it doesn't. And just using the tradition as a lens through which to see these experiences. I think, and which is God's work, and it is sacramental. I think at least for more conventional Christians, to think about the mushrooms as a sacrament is probably pushing it. And I just don't think we need to do that to say that they're valid, because people are doing it and we're having profound experiences like we did in our study. So it's valid because it's our story.
Do you think it can contribute to interfaith dialogue as well?
I mean, if you just take a look at our group, my short answer would be yes. These experiences can definitely accelerate or at least encourage people to engage in interfaith dialogue. How that's done, I've been engaged in interfaith dialogue all of my adult life. How it's done from this moment forward is different to how it was done before I took the medicine. So now I have the incredible privilege of being in community and in friendship with other people from the group. And you're making me think about whether that is interfaith dialogue at some level without it being sort of high on the agenda. Mm-hmm. And that it's happening in a very organic, natural way, which really if that's the case, it pleases my heart, because that friendship to me, has always been the goal of any kind of engagement of that kind, because people meeting people helps us understand who people are rather than read about them, hear about them, often quite sort of pernicious views about some communities, and rely on secondhand information, sometimes even false information, to really understand who other communities are. But this way I get to meet them for myself and get to understand them and make up my own mind and give them the privilege of doing the same when it comes to engaging with me. I think interfaith dialogue in the sort of traditional sense, when it comes to, sharing tea and cake and a conversation about how good we are as human beings, or how much charity we give. Those kinds of things, I don't really think they go very far, at least not in my experience. I've lived through some pretty phenomenal world events that have really challenged interfaith dialogue, particularly in the United Kingdom, and then later in my work in the United States. I feel like a lot of that work has unraveled in the last couple of decades because of those events. And to me, the message from that is that whilst interfaith dialogue is incredibly important, perhaps we are not doing it the way that it's meant to be. It's not about meeting on a Wednesday night over a cup of tea and a slice of cake, but it's really about engaging in the day-to-day with people that you genuinely respect and care about. Maybe there's room for the other, but it's not the space that I occupy anymore. And I have no idea if the rest of my colleagues in the study feel the same. We've never talked about it. But just you asking me this question is making me think that we are doing it. We've just never called it that.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I wonder if the shared experience, we didn't have each individual, we were individually but we had the shared experience of the experience upon reflection, because we all had the same protocol. Some of us had the same guys. Whether we were at Hopkins or NYU, we were in the same room. So we share this very unusual experience of religious professionals in a legal study with psilocybin, and that's a bonding experience. So it creates a level of trust, and maybe a level of trust that you may not get. It's like if you took like in our traditions both, there's an idea of pilgrimage as a religious act. And when you go on a pilgrimage with people and have both the ups and downs of travel and just how it goes when you're with the same people for a long time, there's friction, there's shared joy. And so to have a shared experience creates a bond that you don't get by just talking about, by having the experience of talking over cake and tea is not the same as those experiences we've had, even though they were individual. So I think, and I wonder what it would be like to get a group of, for example, Jewish, Muslim, and Christian people in a circle with, say, ayahuasca or with psilocybin, so that the experience was guided in a way that was open and didn't feel privileging one tradition or not. What that would be like on the other side of that, what it would mean for the relationships. And I know there's some work going on in Palestine and Israel around conflict and trying to get these groups that are really at loggerheads to have an experience of psychedelics to see what their relationships look like after that. And I just wonder if it's not, I think some profound things could happen if you did that, because there's an immediate respect and knowing that seems to happen after a psychedelic experience, especially in a group setting. It's like you know something about each other because you've had that experience together and you trust each other. This group is very trusting.
That's true.
Yeah.
That's true. I think we share things with each other that feel very natural, very flow, but without any kind of premeditation or...
And we barely, in the realm
we barely meet, we barely know each other, yeah. We live in far-flung places, even.
Yeah. All the way from the UK to California.
Yeah.
Across the States and in Mexico.
And Mexico too.
Yeah.